மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
One of the most important things about rook and pawn endings is that they're extremely concrete. Not a lot of the time do you have games that are clearly decided by simple, basic positional factors, like a better minor piece, and such endings like those. In rook and pawn endings, it all depends on exact calculation in the vast majority of cases. And there are rules that govern the play, of course, the general principles that one must know, but everything has to be calculated. These are only guidelines, and one has to be able to think in a concrete way and sometimes disregard these rules. To illustrate this we'll see this really instructive endgame I played. This took place in the Città d'Erba tournament in Italy, 2011. I had the black pieces and my opponent was a master named Pace Pietro. So here it looks on the surface like a completely winning position for black, and in fact it is. It's a really winning position. Almost every move wins at this point. But I was extremely careless here, and kind of didn't really pay attention as much as I should have, and every endgame requires attention until the very end of the game. Sometimes energy is a factor. A person gets tired and lets up their guard at the end when victory is near. That's what happened in this game. So, kind of carelessly, I played h4. I was fully aware that I could just play king g5 to f4. Obviously, bringing the king to f4 is going to be very good, and then escort the pawn down the board. But I decided that h4 was simpler very quickly. I don't think I put a lot of thought into this. Really, it's just positions. White's king is so far away from the king side. Black has a nearly unstoppable passed h-pawn, and the f3 pawn is also weak, and black can just take the f and e pawns at any moment. So it seems like any move wins, and really I think almost every move does win in this position. But king g5 was pretty simple. King g5, for instance, rook c8, king f4, and now black plans to just push the h-pawn or just take the g-pawn as well. Either of these things could be done on the next move. If, for instance, white plays rook h8, then it's possible to just play king takes f3, rook takes h5, king takes e4. It's an important principle for technique that you can transpose from an endgame which is unknown to you into one that's known, where you know that you're winning, and it's a theoretical win. This is a very important principle to use, whereas the unknown endgame could have all kinds of complications which you have no idea. Here in this endgame I know I'm winning. With the white king cut off and the black king in front of the pawn, it's a very easy win. The only defensive try white has in such positions, if his king were, let's say, on c3, and his rook could start checking from in front. Even here it wouldn't work, I think, because black can interpose his rook because his rook's on second rank, but that's the only defensive formation that works. There's no way for white to attain it here. Black will simply push the king and start advancing the pawns. The white king is cut off, so at any moment black can also cut it off on the file if it's necessary. So it's a easily winning position for black. But instead I preferred to just push the pawn directly, which was sufficient. My opponent played rook to c8, and here again I played h3 very carelessly, I think. Here it was real simple to actually just to play rook g6 with the simple plan of putting the rook behind the passed pawn. And if there were any difficulties at all in the position, I would have had no trouble finding this. It just didn't seem necessary at this point. It looked like h3 was sufficient, and I wasn't putting in full concentration as I should have been. This would be a real easy win for black, so let's say rook h8, king g5, next comes rook h6. If white tries to, let's say, bring his king closer, rook h6, white can't trade rook, so he checks, but then king comes to f4, and white's only hope is to go into passive position with his rook, but then black just takes the pawn. So it's very simple. This is probably the most elementary win. Of course, white could also go immediately back with his rook, but it's going to be essentially the same thing. The rook will be locked in a passive position in front of the pawn. And the only detail that had to be seen was that if rook f8, not king g5, because rook f5 and rook takes e5, not sure what's going on there. But instead king g7 is simple enough. And then once again, the h-pawn starts to advance with the rook behind it. But I played h3. It's technically also sufficient, but required me to find the next move. My opponent played rook h8. Now here was a very important, interesting moment, because I had been extremely careless on the previous couple of moves, and now I realized that I had set myself some problems. The obvious moves here are, of course, the rook is attacking the h-pawn, which I can't allow to be captured. The most obvious was rook g3, which I think I intended. But I started to calculate it and see some problems. And eventually I played h2, which turned out also not to win. So rook g3 is the obvious move. You protect the pawn. You don't take the last step because often you need the extra square to hide the king. And meanwhile, I'm ready to just take his f-pawn as well and then bring my king up. But I saw that things weren't as... Now I realize things weren't as easy as my very careless glance from the previous moves had made it out to be. So I saw that he would bring his king to b4, king to g5. Okay, I can't take the f-pawn yet because rook f8, but the king comes closer. King c5, rook takes f3. It makes no difference if I go with my king f4, king d5 will be the same thing. So rook takes, king d5, and now he's attacking my e-pawn, and his idea is that he's going to give up his rook for the h-pawn, and then play the rook against the pawn against the rook, and hope to make a draw there. And I calculated it for a while, and I saw that there were all kinds of problems, and I believe now from pretty long analysis that it's objectively drawn, and so I was correct, although this was the better chance between those two moves. We'll see that those are not the only two moves, but so the analysis is interesting though, so we'll show it because this is important ending. Rook against pawn. This can often happen. It comes generally from a rook and pawn ending where one player has to give up the rook for the opponent's passed pawn and then tries to draw with his own pawn. So here king f4. Now rook f8. He needs to chase my king away from my e-pawn. He could also do it other ways, but it's going to come to the same thing. Rook f8, king g3, rook g8, king f2, rook h8. This also could be, I could start with king takes e5, or white could start with king takes e5, but in any case this move will be played. King g2, now king takes d5, h2. This position was inevitable from this ending. Rook h3 is a threat. Black threatens to cut off the rook from stopping the pawn, and so, as is typical, this helps black a little to gain some time. White has to sacrifice immediately. Can't spend one more move. But the funny thing is that this ending is drawn. So first white goes king d6, clearing the way for the passed pawn, and not blocking it, and at the same time supporting it as far as possible. So this is better than king d5, which wouldn't help to support it through e7. Now the best chance for black is rook to d3, trying to force the king, indeed forcing the king right back in front of the pawn. Instead, if black tried to bring the king immediately with king g3, then e5, king f4, e6, and it's a very easy draw. White's just not in time. So let's say king f5, e7. Already the pawn threatens to queen. e7, king g7, and the pawn queen's next move. Or if check, doesn't make a difference because after king c7, the rook just has to go back. Also if e6, if rook to d3, king c7, rook e3, king d7, and again king f5, e7 in the same position. So king g3, just bringing the king up, black is not in time. So the best try is rook to d3. Now it's kind of interesting. So the king has to go in front of the pawn. You can't be cut off with king c6. This would allow black to get there in time with the king. King g3. Actually, sorry. If king c6, the problem with king c6 is, well, king g3 is possible, but at some point rook e3, forcing the king back, and then king g3, for instance, and black gains a very important tempo and then wins. So instead, after rook to d3, the king has to go to e6. Now back in front of the pawn, and now king g3. And here, its only move is e5, which of course is very natural, but some people might try to shoulder the black king away, which is a typical method, but here it fails. Black has a win with a very unusual maneuver. Rook f3 check first, king g5, rook e3, king f5, and now the only way to get the king closer, king h4. Very surprising, but going to the side of the board actually wins. e5, king h5, king f6, king h6, e6, rook f3, king g7, king e7, king g7, king d7, king f6, e7, and check, driving the king away, and then back, winning the pawn. So king f5, while it's a typical method, shouldering the king, it doesn't work. So e5, however, does draw the game. Perhaps surprisingly. King f4, the only try. King f6. And the black king is not able to advance against the white king. Rook h3. After any moves, white just pushes the pawn and the king. It comes to the same thing. This way black tries to check from the side. But after e6, rook h6, king f7, king e5, and we hope e7, rook h7 check, king f8, and now the only try typical king f6. So now if the pawn queens, of course, then there's checkmate. But instead, this is a theoretical thing. The pawn is promoted to a knight, and the game is drawn because rook can't win against knight, even with the white king on the side of the board. It's very easy defense. However, if white's king and knight were in the corner, then like if white had an h pawn and promoted on h8, the black rook was somewhere over on, let's say, on a7 or somewhere on the queen side, that would be a loss then for white because the knight would be trapped in the corner. But on the side of the board, it's fine. So the game is drawn. So this is very interesting stuff. So it just shows, though, I didn't calculate all of that, but I saw that rook g3 was big problems, and that most likely this ending rook against pawn would be a draw. And therefore, I played what it seemed to me the only other move, h2. Still assuming there would be a way to win. King g5, king f4 is coming, and then king g3, king takes f3, or the king could even come via e3. But this game is drawn now after this move. So it turns out there's a third move, which I didn't even see. I don't believe I even considered it. It didn't enter my range of vision. And the reason is because there's a famous rule in with rooks and pawns that you don't want your rook in front of the passed pawn. And rook h2 seems very strange, because it just puts the rook in front of the passed pawn, which black needs to advance. But in this concrete situation, this is just an elementary win. The reason is that black will succeed in going rook h1 and h2 in time, which will prevent the white king from approaching. White will then have to stay with his king on b2 or a2. Otherwise, the rook will leave h1 either with a check or with the threat of a skewer, as we'll see. So once black achieves rook h1 and h2, the white king is stuck on the queen side, And then it's very simple. The black king comes up and takes white's pawns, and then the game is just easily won. So how it works, let's say, king b3, the white king tries to come closer, rook h1. If he tries king c3 or king c4, any move like that, then comes h2. And now the white king has to head back, because if he comes to c4, or if he was already on c4, he went to d5, the black rook would move away with check, and then black would promote the pawn. Meanwhile, if the king tries to slink along the second rank with king to d2 or even king to c2, trying to come across this way, then comes the typical skewer tactic, rook a1, threatening to queen the pawn. And after rook takes h2, then rook a2, and black wins the rook. So, in view of this, after rook h1, king c3, h2, the white king has to go back to b2. This stops the black from moving the rook away from the pawn. He has no skewer tactic because the edge of the board is in the way. But now the white rook is tied to the h file. Checks do white no good, of course. The black king will just advance. And the white king can't come over to help. Can't either attack black's e-pawn, as we saw in the rook g3 variation, which we saw before, and he can't come over to stop black's h-pawn. So all black needs to do now is just come through with his king. That's very easy to achieve. So now now comes king g5. Well, let's suppose white, instead of doing this with his king, of course, let's suppose he stayed over here and he foresaw, let's say he stayed like this, rook h1, king b2, h2. And now he could cut off the king, but in this case also black breaks the blockade with king g5, g6. And the rook has to move away, and the black king advances. He can't stay on the 5th rank, because then black, after, let's say, rook takes e5, then black just moves the rook out of the way and queens the pawn next. So, back to what we were looking before, king c3, h2, king b2, now king g5. And once again, the black king just advances. Rook h3 is no blockade. King just comes to f4. Next comes to e3, then to f2, and then to g2. And white has to abandon the f-pawn and the e-pawn, which black then takes and wins very easily. So this was a simple win, rook h2, but it's hard to see this move because it's completely in opposition to the basic principles. The rook move looks very strange going in front of the passed pawn. Rook g3 is much more natural, supporting it and leaving this way for the black king to come up and support the pawn, and also attacking the f-pawn without impeding black's h-pawn. But that move doesn't keep the white king at bay, so it's all concrete things. It's concrete features that made rook h2 the correct move. So let's see what happened after h2. He played his king to b3, king g5, king c4, and I played king f4. So I'm trying to just invade with my king. If I tried to cut him off with rook to d2, then he could attack my rook with king c3. And then after rook a2, let's say for instance, then can come back, rook f2, king c4, once again, threatening to invade to d5, makes no difference. Rook d2, king c3, there's always. So black can't effectively cut off the white king, because when the rook's on d2, it will be attacked by the king. And it can't leave the second rank without dropping the h-pawn, and if it leaves the d-file, the white king goes back to its journey. So I played king f4, now king to d5. And here, I was a little bit regretful of my carelessness, but with a little bit of relief, I thought I was still winning, rook a2. Now the plan is simple. Well, I can't take his f-pawn immediately because he takes the e-pawn. And this one's easily easily drawn rook versus pawn. It'll take black several more moves before he can win this pawn, win the rook for the h-pawn. In the meantime, white just advances his king and pawn. So very easy draw there. But I played rook a2, so my plan is simply rook a5 check, followed by king to g3, or king takes f3. Well, actually king g3, assuming white's rook is still in the h-file. with king g3, and then black king will come to g2. White will have to check, then the king will take the f-pawn, and so on. So I thought I'm still winning, but now my opponent was able to stop this rook h3. This creates, while the rook is very passive on h3, it creates a defensive barrier that it's impossible for black to break. The problem is, in order for the king to get in, black has to protect the e-pawn. But the rook is needed to do that, and then that drops the h-pawn. So there's no way to make progress. If king comes with king e3, for instance, king takes e5, and now only black can lose. I guess white would start pushing his e and f pawn, and the black h pawn is too slow. So I moved the rook back and forth a couple times. Rook b2. He has e6 and d5 for his king, so there's no way to put the king in zugzwang, and also f6 as well. So although the white rook has no moves, the white king has sufficient moves. So I went rook g2, king d5, rook a2, king e6, rook d2. The king can't return to d5, but it can go to f6. So still, there's no way for the black king to invade. So here I tried rook d6 check, king e7, forcing the king away. And now if the rook goes back, then the king goes back, or to f6 or to e6, doesn't matter. And there's nothing black can do to make progress. So I did the only thing I could do was keep the king cut off, give up my prized h pawn, and then take his f pawn. And now, because his king is cut off, I still had some slight hope, but of course it's not going to be possible to win the e pawn without allowing white to get his pieces into the right squares. So now rook h4, white defended the e pawn, and I moved again the rook a couple of times back and forth, repeating positions. So white's king is just waiting. Again, the rook has no moves, but the white king can go to f7, e7, or d7, and all these moves are within the reach of the square e6, which the king needs to go to as soon as black plays rook b4. So finally I played rook b4. Okay, it was also possible to try moving the king and get this position, but this is also drawn. Here white just goes rook h1, and white's pieces are so awkward that black immediately wins this pawn with a rook e1. Or if rook f4, then check, for instance, like that. Followed by rook f5, or repeating if the king goes to e3. So I played rook b4. Now the white king stepped up. I took the pawn. Now rook h5. And the only way to guard the pawn, king f4, allows rook f5, which is what happened. King g4, rook takes e5. Rooks are traded and the game is drawn. So what we can learn from this is, first of all, obviously don't be careless. In winning endgame, there's always going to be some sort of tricks. The game is never over until the score sheets are signed. But also, rook and pawn endings are very concrete, and sometimes you have to be ready to break the principles. It's important to know principles, like you don't want to have your rook in front of your passed pawn, but you also need to have a flexible mindset that can allow you to consider every possible move if the situation warrants it.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.